February 18th, 1995. Plazuela de Santa Isabel. Inside the old walls of Intramuros, Manila. Under a heavy tropical sky, the camera moved slowly toward a bronze figure. A hooded woman slumped on broken stone, cradling a lifeless child, surrounded by other twisted bodies in anguish. This was the Memorare, Manila 1945 monument, erected to remember more than 100,000 civilians killed in the battle for the liberation of Manila between February 3 and March 3, 1945. Among the wreaths and candles stood an elderly man in a barong, Ambassador Miguel Pérez-Rubio. On the program, he was introduced as a former guerrilla fighter and the sole surviving member of his immediate family. While Japanese Marines were massacring his relatives in their Vito Cruz home in February 1945, Pérez-Rubio was far to the north, imprisoned and tortured by the Kempeitai. In his hands, he held a small, faded photograph of a vanished house. The narrator explained that Manila was the second most devastated Allied capital after Warsaw, its destruction so complete that contemporary observers compared it to Stalingrad. Yet outside the Philippines, the story of its death remained largely unknown. Then the central question: how did a city that was supposed to be liberated become a slaughterhouse, where more civilians died than in either Hiroshima or Nagasaki? To answer that, the film turned back to the city Manila had once been, and to the men whose decisions would decide whether it lived or died. In 1938, late afternoon sunlight glowed along Dewey Boulevard, where acacia trees lined the edge of Manila Bay. Streetcars rattled past Art Deco facades. The Bayview Hotel's white exterior reflected the water like polished marble. Families in European suits and Filipino barong walked under parasols, while carriages and early automobiles shared the broad avenue. Travel films of the period called Manila the Pearl of the Orient, a hybrid Spanish-American Asian capital where Baroque churches stood alongside American office blocks and modern commercial districts. Inside the old walled city of Intramuros, the camera traced stone ramparts laid in the Spanish era, Baroque facades of San Agustin Church and Manila Cathedral, and narrow cobblestone streets between high stone houses with Kempeitai shell windows that caught the light like scattered diamonds. Outside the walls, newer districts like Ermita and Malate showed cinemas advertising American films, department stores with plate glass windows, and the government complex rising among orderly rows of acacias. The University of Santo Tomas, with its imposing main building completed just years earlier, symbolized the intellectual life of the capital. The Manila Hotel, overlooking the bay with its white columns and manicured gardens, stood as the crown jewel of the waterfront. In that hotel lived General Douglas MacArthur, field marshal and military advisor to the Philippine Commonwealth. Newsreel footage showed him on balconies and at ceremonies with President Manuel Quezon, visibly identifying himself with the city and its destiny. He walked its streets as if they were his own, memorizing the boulevards and landmarks that would haunt him through the coming years. Then the calendar jumped. December 1941. Japanese aircraft attacked Clark Field and other bases across Luzon. American and Filipino troops fell back toward Bataan and Corregidor, the fortified islands guarding Manila Bay. Civilian footage showed hasty sandbag emplacements on Manila's streets, nervous shoppers glancing at the sky between the familiar buildings that had seemed so permanent just weeks before. On January 2, 1942, Japanese troops of the 14th Army marched into Manila. Filipino diarist Pasita Pestano Jacinto and others recorded the shock of seeing Japanese uniforms on familiar corners, American and Commonwealth flags pulled down, street signs replaced with Japanese script. Rationing began within days. Censorship tightened like a closing fist. Shortages and fear became daily facts of life, written in the faces of residents who had never imagined occupation. Yet by early 1945, as photographs and official surveys would later show, Manila, though scarred by 3 years of occupation, remained a functioning city. Its churches still lifted their spires above the streets. Government buildings, though repurposed by the occupation authority, still stood. Schools operated under Japanese supervision. Many homes remained intact, their residents adapting to the harsh realities of military rule, while hoping for liberation that everyone knew must eventually come. For 3 years, Manila lived under occupation. The theaters stayed dark or showed propaganda films. The university became an internment camp, the harbor filled with Japanese shipping. But the city itself survived, its stone and concrete enduring through shortages and repression. The decisions that sealed its fate would be made not in these streets, but in the minds of three men: an American general who vowed to return, a Japanese general who wanted to abandon the city, and a Japanese admiral who refused to let it go. Manila had survived conquest. What it could not survive was liberation. On October 20th, 1944, waves crashed onto the beaches of Leyte Gulf as General Douglas MacArthur waded ashore, pipe in hand, broadcast microphones recording his famous declaration. "I have returned." Newsreels carried the images across the world, showing the general striding through knee-deep water with studied determination. The liberation of the Philippines had begun, and MacArthur had made it unmistakably personal. Behind that theatrical moment lay a complex, bitter campaign spreading across the Philippine archipelago. On Luzon, the main island, Japan's forces came under a new commander, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, victor of Singapore and now head of the 14th Area Army. From a makeshift headquarters in the Luzon highlands, Yamashita studied maps spread across rough plank tables in quarters far removed from Manila's comfort. His situation reports painted a stark picture. Allied naval and air superiority dominated the seas and skies around Luzon completely. His army faced ammunition shortages, fuel scarcity that left trucks immobilized, and supply lines fragmented by American submarines and aircraft that prowled the waters between Japan and the Philippines like hungry predators. Yamashita, a professional soldier who had studied modern warfare extensively, concluded that he could not hold Manila against the inevitable Allied blow. The city sat on flat coastal terrain, vulnerable to naval bombardment and amphibious assault, with no natural defensive advantages and a massive civilian population that would complicate any prolonged defense. His strategy, later summarized in Allied intelligence reports and post-war interrogations, was to withdraw major forces into the Cordillera and Sierra Madre Mountains, forcing a prolonged war of attrition in terrain favorable to the defender. Let the Americans have the cities and plains. Bleed them in the jungle highlands where supply lines stretched thin and terrain negated their technological advantages. In January 1945, Yamashita issued orders to evacuate Manila. Bridges and key port facilities were to be demolished to deny them to the advancing enemy, but the city itself, he intended, would not become a battlefield. His attention was already shifting to defensive positions inland, to mountain redoubts where determined troops with limited supplies could hold out for months. But in Manila, another man saw matters very differently. Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, commander of the Manila Naval Defense Force and 31st Naval Base Force, bore a personal stigma that colored every decision. As captain of the battleship Kirishima, he had been aboard when the ship was sunk off Guadalcanal in November 1942 during a chaotic night action. Many contemporaries believed this disgrace weighed heavily on him, a stain on honor that Japanese naval culture considered almost unbearable. Now, with around 12,500 naval troops under his command and an additional 4,500 army troops available in the capital, he saw a chance to erase past shame in what he called a glorious last stand. Japanese records and Allied interrogations, while incomplete due to the destruction of documents and death of most principals, suggest a fatal divergence in command. While Yamashita's orders called for withdrawal, messages from naval authorities in Japan and Iwabuchi's own mindset pushed toward holding Manila. To the last man and last bullet, public buildings, schools, and churches were quietly turned into strongpoints during January. Engineers knocked holes in interior walls to create interlocking fire lanes. Mines and demolitions were prepared with methodical care. Barricades went up at key intersections using whatever materials came to hand. Concrete rubble, burned vehicles, furniture dragged from nearby buildings. By late January, Yamashita's field formations were slipping away into the mountains as planned, leaving Manila's approaches increasingly empty of organized resistance. But inside Manila, Iwabuchi's men were digging in among the homes, hospitals, and churches of a living city with 750,000 souls. The civilians of Manila, going about their constrained daily lives under occupation, were being trapped between two incompatible Japanese plans. One general wanted to save their city by abandoning it. One admiral intended to defend it to annihilation. Nobody asked the Manilinos which fate they preferred. On January 9, 1945, gray surf broke against landing craft at Lingayen Gulf, northwestern Luzon. Ramps dropped with metallic clangs, and infantry pushed ashore under the guns of American warships, whose hulls stretched along the horizon like gray mountains. This was the opening blow of General Walter Kruger's 6th Army campaign to retake Luzon, and it landed 68,000 troops on the first day alone. Among the assault formations were the 1st Cavalry Division, under Major General Vern D. Mudge, and the 37th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Robert Baitler. Their tanks and flying columns began a rapid drive south, using speed and motorization to outflank scattered Japanese resistance. On dusty roads across the Central Plain, columns of Sherman tanks, half-tracks loaded with infantry, and jeeps towing anti-tank guns passed rice paddies and villages under a canopy of American fighter aircraft that patrolled constantly, ready to pounce on any Japanese unit foolish enough to move in daylight. The expected large-scale set-piece battle never fully materialized. Yamashita's main field formations were already withdrawing toward the mountains as planned, leaving only rear guards and isolated units to slow the American advance. American reports noted stubborn local resistance in some areas, a destroyed bridge here, a company defending a village there, but vast stretches of near-empty road in between, eerily quiet compared to the brutal fighting expected. These were early signs of the Japanese High Command's decision to abandon the plains in favor of interior redoubts, though American intelligence took days to fully understand the pattern. By late January, American spearheads were within striking distance of Manila. Sherman tanks covered dozens of kilometers some days, their tracks chewing up the roads while cavalry troopers scanned villages and tree lines for ambushes that rarely came. MacArthur, conscious of the city's symbolic and strategic importance, pressed his commanders to move quickly, hoping to seize the capital and its vital harbor facilities before the Japanese could destroy them. Every day of delay meant more demolitions, more fortifications, more preparation for whatever resistance waited in the city. Inside Manila, however, Japanese engineers under Iwabuchi were already wiring the Pasig River bridges for demolition with enough explosives to drop their spans into the muddy water. Barricades of sandbags, rubble, and burned vehicles sprang up at key intersections like mushrooms after rain. Government buildings, schools, and convents were quietly converted into fortresses, their walls reinforced with sandbags and interior rooms transformed into ammunition stores and aid stations. The first American patrols reaching the city's outskirts in early February encountered an unsettling pattern. In some northern districts, resistance collapsed quickly. Units advanced almost unopposed through streets where Japanese rear guards had already withdrawn. In others, particularly closer to the Pasig River and in southern districts, they ran into prepared positions and precise small arms fire from concealed machine guns that had been carefully sighted to cover every approach. The split between Yamashita's abandoned sectors and Iwabuchi's core defense was beginning to take shape on the ground, drawn in bullets and blood. For civilians, the advance brought rumors more than clarity. Word spread that American forces were near. Some said days away, others insisted they were already in the northern suburbs. Reports also filtered through that Japanese troops were demolishing bridges and seizing buildings in the city center. Families debated whether to flee and if so, where to go. Some chose to remain in place, trusting in churches and religious houses as traditional sanctuaries that even war would respect. Others tried to move north toward the sound of American guns, only to find roads blocked by Japanese guards or fighting already underway. On February 1st, elements of the 1st Cavalry received an order that would carry them directly into the heart of Manila. Push fast to secure Malacanang Palace and, beyond it, the University of Santo Tomas, where thousands of Allied civilians had been interned since 1942. What awaited them in the northern half of the city would look, at first, like a clean liberation. Cameras rolling, prisoners freed, American flags raised over familiar buildings. South of the Pasig River, it would be something else entirely. In the early afternoon of February 3, 1945, tanks of the 44th Tank Battalion rumbled across the Tullahan River Bridge, their tracks clattering on steel and concrete plates that echoed through the northern suburbs. Cavalry troopers of the 1st Cavalry Division clung to the hulls, rifles ready, eyes scanning windows and rooftops. Ahead lay the northern districts of Manila, and beyond them, thousands of prisoners waiting in a camp that had been their prison for 3 years. The flying column, led by units of the 8th Cavalry under Brigadier General William C. Chase, pushed rapidly through narrow streets, encountering sporadic fire from Japanese rearguards but no coordinated defense. Smoke from demolished facilities drifted over rooftops, the acrid smell mixing with dust. Civilians peered from windows or disappeared into doorways as tanks clattered past, uncertain whether to cheer or hide. The column's first major objective was Malacanang Palace, seat of the Philippine presidency, its distinctive architecture familiar from pre-war newsreels and photographs. By early evening, cavalrymen had entered its grounds and raised American colors over the building, a symbolic reclaiming of national authority that newsreel cameramen captured for theaters back home. But another target lay just beyond, more urgent and more personal. The University of Santo Tomas, whose campus had served as a major internment camp since early 1942. Archival photographs and internment records showed more than 4,000 prisoners. Americans, Britons, other Allied nationals, and Filipino civilians, held behind its walls at the peak of the camp's population. By early 1945, more than 3,700 remained, packed into classrooms and dormitories never designed for such use. As darkness fell on February 3rd, tanks and cavalrymen reached the campus. Japanese sentries opened fire from the gates. Return fire followed almost immediately, tracers cutting through the gathering dusk. One Sherman tank, its commander deciding speed mattered more than caution, smashed through the university gates, its 30-ton hull scraping stone pillars designed only to stop pedestrians. Inside, exhausted and malnourished internees pressed against windows and balcony railings, staring at the sight they had waited 3 years to see. American soldiers and tanks on the campus, coming to set them free. The battle for Santo Tomas was brief but tense. One group of Japanese troops barricaded themselves in a building with several dozen hostages, creating a standoff. Negotiations and limited fighting followed, resolved only after days of careful maneuvering. But the majority of guards were quickly overwhelmed or fled into the night, abandoning their posts as American firepower proved overwhelming. Newsreel footage and eyewitness accounts captured scenes of emaciated men and women greeting soldiers with tears streaming down hollow cheeks, improvised American flags sewn from scraps, and half-whispered songs because their voices lacked strength for more. Some internees weighed barely half their pre-war body weight. Interment records documented hundreds of deaths from disease and malnutrition during the previous 3 years, their bodies buried in a corner of the campus that had become a makeshift cemetery. For American commanders entering from the north, the liberation of Santo Tomas seemed to confirm an optimistic assessment. Perhaps Manila could be retaken quickly, its core neighborhoods spared the devastation that had consumed other Pacific battlegrounds. Resistance north of the Pasig was relatively light. Yamashita's evacuation plan appeared to be working in their favor, leaving a city ready to be liberated rather than defended. But the film then cut away to Tanda, a working-class district of narrow streets and crowded housing near the waterfront. There, on the same day as the Santo Tomas breakthrough, Japanese troops at the Daipak lumber yard rounded up roughly 115 men, women, and children from nearby neighborhoods, tied their hands with wire, and slaughtered them among stacks of timber that would later burn. United States war crimes investigations after the battle documented bullet wounds, bayonet injuries, and burned bodies, a massacre almost entirely unknown to the cheerful crowds celebrating at Santo Tomas that same night. The narrator juxtaposed these two realities. In the north, a clean liberation, prisoners freed, flags raised over familiar buildings, cameras recording triumph. In other districts, quiet killing grounds with no cameras present, no witnesses to survive, no newsreels to document what was already becoming systematic murder. The liberation of Santo Tomas would be the last uncomplicated victory in Manila. From here onward, every block taken would be paid for twice, in soldiers' blood, and in the lives of civilians caught between a trapped garrison and an army determined to crush it. On February 5th, the camera returned to Dewey Boulevard, Manila's showcase waterfront avenue. Pre-war photographs showed palm trees swaying over manicured lawns, the Bayview Hotel's white facade gleaming, and couples strolling along the seawall watching sunsets paint Manila Bay in gold and crimson. Wartime footage now revealed sandbagged intersections, trenches dug into the median strip, and crude tank traps made of steel girders and rubble blocking the broad avenue at regular intervals. The narrator introduced the Pasig River as both a physical and symbolic dividing line cutting through Manila's heart. North of the river, American units were extending control over districts where Japanese resistance had largely collapsed, advancing block by block with minimal casualties. South of it, in Ermita, Malate, Paco, and Singalong, Iwabuchi's forces were turning residential neighborhoods into a defensive belt using methods that blurred the line between military necessity and deliberate atrocity. Japanese engineers had transformed key structures into fortresses with methodical care. Government buildings like the finance and legislative buildings, university complexes, and even substantial private residences were reinforced with whatever materials came to hand. Interior walls were blown out with carefully placed charges to create internal corridors allowing movement without exposing troops to fire from outside. Machine gun nests looked down on streets through carefully chipped loopholes that offered narrow fields of fire while protecting the gunners. Intersections were blocked with wrecked vehicles and debris, forcing any attackers into narrow lanes swept by interlocking fire from multiple positions. The Bayview Hotel, once a symbol of pre-war glamour along Dewey Boulevard where wealthy travelers enjoyed ocean views and modern amenities, figured prominently in survivor testimony and war crimes investigations conducted after the battle. Requisitioned by Japanese naval troops, it became one of several centers where women and girls were imprisoned and repeatedly raped over days and weeks. Witnesses who survived later described captives pulled from surrounding neighborhoods, separated from their families, and detained in rooms where they were assaulted by multiple perpetrators. Many never emerged alive, their bodies disposed of as American forces drew closer. From the American perspective, the battle south of the Pasig shifted quickly from open maneuver to close-quarters urban combat of the most brutal kind. The 37th Infantry Division advanced from the north and east, crossing the Pasig under fire. Elements of the 11th Airborne Division pushed in from the south after landing at Nasugbu. Infantry after-action reports described moving house to house under sniper fire and grenades thrown from upper floors. Every doorway potentially hiding a machine gun, every window a sniper's position. Tanks and self-propelled guns were brought up to fire directly into suspicious buildings at point-blank range. Infantry advanced behind blasts from flamethrowers and demolition charges that blew holes through walls. For civilians trapped in the Southside districts, the battle transformed neighborhoods into prisons. Japanese troops forced residents into designated refuge centers. Schools, social clubs, churches, and large houses hastily designated as safe areas. Officially, these were established to protect civilians from the fighting. In practice, many doubled as firing positions or as holding pens for later massacres. Families crowded into hallways and basements as gunfire echoed outside, not knowing whether the soldiers guarding them offered protection or posed the primary threat. American troops advancing through Ermita and Malate began finding bodies in houses, streets, and courtyards. Civilians who had clearly been executed rather than caught in crossfire. Bound hands, bayonet wounds, bodies showing signs of systematic killing rather than combat casualties. Reports filtered back to division headquarters describing atrocities, but the full scale remained unclear as fighting continued street by street. As American units probed deeper into Ermita and Malate in early February, they discovered something chilling. Iwabuchi's men were not simply defending the city in any conventional military sense. They were destroying it from within, starting with its people, in a campaign of violence that served no tactical purpose and violated every understood norm of warfare. Rumors spread of violence at a Catholic college on Taft Avenue, run by the De La Salle brothers. Hundreds of civilians had taken refuge there, believing that a chapel and religious habit would still offer protection in a war that seemed to be consuming every other boundary between combatant and non-combatant. That belief, ancient in warfare and respected even in brutal conflicts, would soon be tested in the most brutal way possible. The sanctity of churches, schools, and hospitals, conventions that had endured through centuries of Christian warfare, was about to be revealed as nothing more than a comforting illusion when faced with an enemy who recognized no limits. The camera entered De La Salle College on Taft Avenue on the morning of February 12, 1945, guided by contemporary photographs taken after the battle and post-war reconstructions based on survivor testimony. The college's neoclassical buildings framed a central courtyard, their design reflecting both Spanish and American architectural influences. At one end stood the Chapel of the Most Blessed Sacrament, its marble altar and stained glass, once the centerpiece of campus religious life. In the first days of February, as fighting intensified in neighboring districts and the thunder of artillery grew louder each day, civilians had streamed into De La Salle and nearby religious houses seeking sanctuary. Families believed that the presence of foreign brothers, many of them German or other neutral nationals, and Irish and Filipino priests would deter Japanese violence in the way that religious neutrality had protected churches in earlier conflicts. Records compiled after the battle show that 16 Christian brothers and at least 25 civilian men, women, and children were sheltering in the college building, particularly around the chapel where spiritual authority seemed strongest. Survivor accounts and ecclesiastical investigations later pieced together what happened in those final hours. Japanese soldiers entered the compound on February 9th, initially looting food and valuables, then occupying parts of the building and establishing firing positions. Over the next 3 days, as American forces drew closer and the sound of tank fire echoed through the streets, the situation deteriorated. By February 12th, under orders that remain murky in origin but were consistent with wider patterns of massacres documented throughout Manila that month, a decision was made to kill everyone inside the college. In the chapel, refugees crowded between wooden pews worn smooth by decades of prayer. Candles cast flickering light against stained glass that depicted saints whose protection had failed utterly. The brothers moved through the crowd, offering what spiritual comfort they could to families who whispered prayers in Tagalog, Spanish, and English. Among the brothers were men later identified in memorial plaques and religious records. Brother Flavius Leo and others whose names are preserved in De La Salle's roll of martyrs. Father Francis Cosgrave, an Irish priest who had served the community for years, tended to the refugees as gunfire grew closer, his presence offering comfort even as hope faded. When Japanese troops entered the chapel in force, they did not distinguish between clergy and laity, between neutral nationals and enemy civilians. Witnesses who survived by hiding recalled grenades thrown into the packed chapel, their blasts magnified by stone walls, followed by rifle and machine gun fire that continued methodically until the screaming stopped. Bodies fell between pews where families had huddled together. Wounded survivors tried to shield children or crawl behind the high altar where the Blessed Sacrament had been kept. Soldiers moved through the aisles with bayonets, finishing the wounded. Later testimonies from rare survivors spoke of floors slick with blood that soaked into centuries-old wood, bodies piled 3 and 4 deep near the altar, groans coming from beneath heaps of the dead where a few still clung to life. A handful of survivors hid inside rooms, behind the altar's bulk, or among the bodies themselves, remaining motionless for hours until the perpetrators had moved on to other targets. Similar patterns of violence emerged in the investigation of St. Paul's Convent, San Juan de Dios Hospital, and other religious institutions where civilians had taken shelter trusting in conventions that had protected churches through centuries of warfare. The notion of sacred space, long respected even in brutal conflicts, had broken down entirely in the urban inferno of 1945 Manila. Not even children received mercy. Not even priests and nuns were spared. American forces, fighting blocks away, had only fragmentary reports of atrocities as they unfolded. Their immediate focus remained on reducing Japanese strongpoints that poured fire into advancing infantry, on staying alive in a maze of sniper positions and booby traps, on supporting wounded comrades while pushing forward street by bloody street. By mid-February, the massacres had become systematic rather than isolated incidents. At the same time, American commanders found themselves facing a bitter choice. Continue to fight block by block, room by room, accepting mounting casualties, or bring in the heavy guns that could reduce strongpoints quickly but would inevitably kill civilians trapped inside. If Japanese units were willing to slaughter civilians, including priests and nuns, in a chapel dedicated to the Blessed Sacrament, what would they do when finally cornered behind the centuries-old walls of Intramuros, Manila's historic heart? And what would the Americans be prepared to do to dislodge them from those ancient fortifications? The answers were about to be written in fire and steel. The film returned to Ermita on the night of February 12th, this time focusing on a single house, the elegant Pérez-Rubio residence near Vito Cruz. Family photographs showed high ceilings with elaborate moldings, polished Nara wood floors, and a large household of relatives and staff living in the comfortable style of Manila's educated class. During the battle, Miguel Pérez-Rubio was absent. He had joined the guerrillas and, by February 1945, was being held and tortured by the Japanese secret police in Baguio, far to the north. What he did not know, as later accounts emphasized, was that back in Manila, Japanese Marines entered his family home and massacred nearly everyone inside. When the killing ended, only one relative, an Assumption nun who happened to be elsewhere, survived with him. His story was not unique in any way. War crimes investigations and survivor testimonies documented massacres across Paco, Santa Ana, Tanda, and other districts in a pattern so widespread that investigators struggled to catalog every site. In some cases, Japanese troops ordered residents into large houses, warehouses, or school buildings under pretexts of safety, then set the structures on fire or used grenades and machine guns on those inside. In other instances, civilians were taken to cemeteries, lumber yards, or vacant lots and executed in groups, their bodies left where they fell or burned to conceal evidence. Maps on screen showed markers dotting central Manila, each pin representing an atrocity site, each caption a rough estimate of victims. 50 here, 200 there. Entire extended families erased from existence in minutes. At the same time, American units were paying their own price in house-to-house fighting. Reports from regiments such as the 129th Infantry described squads losing men to snipers firing from attics and upper-story windows. Patrols blown apart by mines hidden in doorways and stairwells. Entire platoons pinned down for hours by machine guns in reinforced positions. The slow grind of urban combat eroded patience and consumed ammunition faster than supply lines could replenish. Commanders faced mounting casualty lists and increasing pressure from higher headquarters to break Japanese resistance more quickly. Discussions within the 37th Infantry Division staff turned increasingly to heavy firepower. Artillery and direct-fire weapons had already been used in some areas, their shells crashing into suspected strongpoints with devastating effect. But proposals now emerged to use mass guns against the densest concentrations of Japanese defenders, even in historically and culturally significant areas that peacetime sensibilities would have considered sacrosanct. For civilians trapped in the southern districts, choices narrowed to impossible calculations. Japanese troops often forbade movement, shooting anyone who attempted to leave designated refuge areas as spies or guerrillas. Those who attempted to flee risked being shot by Japanese guards, caught in crossfire between opposing forces, or struck by American artillery falling on suspected enemy positions. Bodies lay uncollected in streets and courtyards for days, making any attempt at movement physically and psychologically harrowing. The stench of death hung over entire neighborhoods. Water supplies failed as pipes were severed by explosions. Food stocks dwindled as fires consumed stores and markets. Disease began spreading in crowded refuge centers where sanitation had collapsed. The city was dying from within even as battles raged for control of its ruins. By mid-February, both sides had reached a point of no return. Iwabuchi's forces were surrounded on all sides, convinced that death in place was preferable to the shame of surrender that Japanese military culture could not accept. American commanders, seeing their casualties mount daily and facing pressure to secure Manila's port facilities for upcoming operations, were running out of patience with methods that preserved buildings at the cost of soldiers' lives. The next major decision would determine the fate of Manila's oldest quarter, Intramuros, the walled city that had stood since Spanish colonial times, whose stone ramparts and Baroque churches represented 4 centuries of Philippine history. The question was no longer whether Intramuros would become a battlefield. The question was how much of it would survive. On the morning of February 17th, the camera panned along the north bank of the Pasig River. Rows of American artillery stretched into the distance, 105mm and 155mm howitzers, self-propelled guns, and tanks positioned to fire directly into Intramuros, the centuries-old walled city across the muddy water. Inside the command posts of the 37th Infantry Division, staff officers studied large-scale maps annotated with intelligence estimates derived from aerial reconnaissance and reports from patrols. Japanese positions were marked at bastions like Baluarte de San Diego and in buildings just inside the ancient walls. Fort Santiago, the Cathedral District, and other key points were believed to house machine guns, mortars, and artillery observers who could call fire down on any unit attempting to cross the river. Technical details from United States Army histories described a fire plan involving roughly 140 guns, firing both indirect artillery missions and direct fire at nearly point-blank range. Some guns would lob shells from distances up to 8,000 yards away, their projectiles arcing high before plunging down onto targets. Others would fire at ranges as close as 250 yards, their barrels almost level with the ground, to punch holes in fortifications that had withstood typhoons and earthquakes for centuries. The goal was not precise destruction of individual gun nests, which would have required impossibly accurate intelligence, but the systematic collapse of walls, roofs, and interior structures sheltering Iwabuchi's men. In staff discussions reconstructed from post-war interviews and official reports, commanders weighed competing obligations that would haunt them for decades, minimizing their own infantry casualties versus limiting harm to the civilians still trapped inside the walled city. Earlier attempts at limited infantry assaults against prepared positions in other districts had produced casualty rates approaching those of the worst Pacific Island battles. The Japanese had shown no sign of surrender despite being surrounded and cut off from supply. Intelligence reports indicated they continued to use civilians as forced labor for building fortifications and as human shields in firing positions. Inside Intramuros, Japanese troops forced civilians to dig trenches and build barricades under threat of execution, or herded them into designated zones in churches, convents, and schools where families huddled in darkness as the sound of American preparations grew louder. Survivor accounts described families debating whether to remain in basements and crypts, trusting thick stone walls to protect them, or to risk moving through the streets under shellfire in hopes of reaching American lines. There was little reliable information about which choice offered better odds of survival. When the order finally came to commence firing, it marked a turning point in the battle and in Manila's history. The first ranging rounds from the north bank landed against the stone walls, throwing up geysers of dust and fragments of masonry that had stood since the 1600s. Observers adjusted coordinates. Then the full fire plan began in earnest. Guns barked in sequence across the riverbank, their recoil rocking carriages and sending shock waves across the water. Shells traced invisible arcs overhead before detonating among the bastions and rooftops of Intramuros with thunderous crashes that could be heard across the entire city. From across the river, observers watched through binoculars as chunks of masonry sloughed off ramparts that had once repelled pirates and revolutionaries, and roofs collapsed in cascades of tile and timber onto streets where generations had walked. Inside the walls, civilians and soldiers alike felt the ground shudder with each impact, and ancient buildings that had survived centuries began to crumble under weapons they were never designed to withstand. In that moment, Intramuros ceased to be a historic quarter to be preserved and catalogued. It became a target, marked on maps with coordinates and firing data. For 6 days, the guns would speak their mechanical language of destruction. Manila's oldest district would not survive the conversation. By February 18th, Fort Santiago's courtyard, already stained by years of executions under Japanese occupation, where countless Filipino patriots had been tortured and killed, shook under repeated shell impacts that sent tremors through ancient stone. Archival photographs taken after the battle showed its walls pocked with fresh craters, layers of damage that told the story of centuries. Spanish musket balls, American naval bombardment from 1898, and now modern artillery that tore through masonry with unprecedented force. Aerial reconnaissance footage revealed clouds of dust blossoming along the lines of Intramuros's walls, as shells slammed into ramparts and bastions in systematic patterns that worked their way around the perimeter. Roofs of convents and residences caved in, spilling ancient beams and clay tiles into courtyards that had been peaceful gardens just weeks before. Fires broke out across multiple blocks, their smoke mixing with dust in a gray-brown haze that hung over the old city like a funeral shroud, visible from kilometers away. Inside, civilians crammed into church crypts, basements, and interior rooms, seeking protection in the deepest and most solid structures they could find. Survivors later recalled the suffocating darkness, the constant thunder of artillery that made speech impossible, and the fine dust that filtered through every crack and crevice, coating hair and clothing, filling lungs, turning everyone into gray ghosts. Above them, Japanese troops moved between firing positions using improvised tunnels and paths smashed through interior walls, maintaining resistance even as the world collapsed around them. Fort Santiago, long a symbol of colonial repression under Spanish, American, and now Japanese rule, became the site of final atrocities as the battle reached its climax. As American shells drew closer and the inevitable end became clear, Japanese guards reportedly killed remaining prisoners in the fort's dungeons rather than let them be liberated. Some cells were deliberately flooded, drowning captives who had no means of escape. After the battle, investigators found skeletons in cramped, waterlogged chambers near the Pasig, their remains telling stories of suffering that would never be fully documented. On the riverbanks, American engineer and infantry units prepared to breach the walls that artillery had weakened but not yet penetrated. One assault company from the 148th Infantry Regiment crossed under covering fire, hugging the riverbank as shells impacted further inside the fortifications. Combat engineers moved with satchel charges and flamethrowers, seeking weak points in the stone and plaster that had been compromised by days of bombardment. Tactical details from unit reports described breaching operations conducted under the most difficult conditions. Demolition teams placing explosives at the base of walls while under fire from defenders who fought from the rubble, then falling back as charges detonated with earth-shaking roars. Infantry squads sprinting through newly opened gaps in the walls into smoke-filled streets. Tanks brought up to fire point-blank into loopholes and narrow alleys just inside the fortifications. There, shells ricocheting off stone at crazy angles. The fighting was close and brutal beyond anything most veterans had experienced. Japanese positions rarely surrendered. Most defenders fought to the last man in cellars and upper rooms, forcing attackers to clear each building with grenades and flamethrowers. American troops sometimes discovered dozens of bodies in a single room, some in uniform, some clearly civilians, their identities obliterated by blast and fire, making it impossible to determine who had been combatants and who had simply been trapped in the wrong place. As Intramuros burned and crumbled under bombardment and assault, its last defender prepared to meet the fate he had chosen for himself and his command. Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, somewhere within the shrinking fortress, refused all thought of surrender even as his position became completely untenable. By February 21st, attention shifted slightly west and south within Manila's central district, to the blocks housing the agriculture and finance buildings. These large, reinforced concrete structures, built during the American colonial era with modern materials and engineering, now stood blackened by fire, their windows shattered by explosions, but still structurally sound enough to serve as fortresses. Japanese defenders had turned their thick walls and interior corridors into a final network of strongpoints that would take days to reduce. American infantry advancing into these buildings found stairwells covered by overlapping fields of fire from multiple positions and rooms rigged with mines that detonated when doors were opened or floors were stepped on. The thickness of reinforced concrete floors and walls, an advantage in peacetime for earthquake resistance and durability, now made them extraordinarily difficult to clear without heavy explosives and close-range fire that endangered the attackers almost as much as the defenders. Reports from the 37th Infantry Division described tank destroyers and Sherman tanks brought up to fire directly into lower floors at ranges of less than 50 meters, blasting entry points for assault teams who would then fight their way inside through smoke and rubble. Flamethrower operators advanced meter by meter, sending jets of burning fuel into suspected positions, the flames sucking oxygen from the air and making breathing difficult even for the attackers. Grenades bounced down stairwells in deadly cascades. In some cases, entire rooms were reduced by demolition charges before infantry dared enter, the explosions bringing down ceilings and collapsing floors. Amid the rubble and burning wreckage, troops stumbled on civilians, some clearly executed with hands bound behind their backs, others crushed by falling masonry or burned where they had taken shelter from the fighting. Letters home and later oral history interviews recorded the shock many soldiers felt at the scale of non-combatant deaths, even after months of hard campaigning elsewhere in the Pacific where they had seen combat and death in many forms. Japanese sources, fragmentary as they are due to the death of most officers and destruction of records, indicate that in these final days, Iwabuchi sent farewell messages to higher command stressing duty and sacrifice in the samurai tradition. With communications degraded by the destruction of telephone lines and radio equipment, direct orders were difficult to trace with certainty, but no evidence emerged of any attempt to negotiate surrender or seek terms. The concept simply did not exist in Iwabuchi's calculus. Around February 23 to 25, as American units tightened their grip on the last major positions still holding out, Iwabuchi and members of his staff committed suicide, most likely in a nearby command post, following the military tradition that saw death preferable to capture. Their bodies were never definitively identified amid the carnage and destruction, but as Japanese post-war accounts and Allied investigative records converged over the following years, historians concluded that the admiral died in the ruins of the city he had refused to abandon, taking with him the answers to questions that would haunt the battle's legacy. By battle's end, American forces reported approximately 1,010 killed and 5,565 wounded in the Battle of Manila, casualty figures that made it one of the costliest urban battles in the Pacific War. Japanese military deaths in the city were estimated at around 16,000, the vast majority killed in the final redoubts around Intramuros and the government district, with almost no prisoners taken. But as reports came in from every district, compiled by military intelligence officers and Filipino authorities beginning to survey the devastation, it became clear that the most staggering numbers did not come from military roles at all. Early counts from city officials, church authorities, and Allied investigators indicated that civilian deaths, from Japanese massacres, American and Japanese artillery, aerial bombardment, fire, starvation, and building collapses, had reached well into the tens of thousands and were still being tallied. Partial counts suggested more than 100,000 civilian dead in barely 1 month of fighting, a figure later widely accepted in official histories and memorial inscriptions. The narrator summarized the moment bluntly. When the shooting finally stopped, the Americans had taken Manila. But the city they held was not a liberated capital. It was a murdered 1-inch. On March 3, 1945, aerial reconnaissance flights passed over Manila on clear weather missions to document the extent of destruction. Black and white photographs taken that day and in the weeks that followed showed square kilometer after square kilometer of devastation. Entire neighborhoods where only chimneys, fragments of walls, and church towers interrupted a carpet of rubble that stretched to the horizon. That same date is widely recognized as marking the end of organized resistance in the city. Intramuros had fallen days before. Iwabuchi's units had been annihilated or scattered into isolated pockets. American and Filipino guerrilla forces now turned their attention to mopping up operations in the countryside outside the capital. But inside Manila, a different and grimmer kind of work began. United States engineer units and Filipino authorities formed recovery teams to search for bodies and begin the overwhelming task of documentation. They entered sites already known from fragmentary wartime reports, the Daipak Lumber Yard, De La Salle College, Fort Santiago, the Bayview Hotel, as well as countless homes, apartments, and makeshift shelters where massacre sites were discovered by chance or reported by survivors. At Daipak, they found skeletal remains among charred timbers, bones scattered by fire and scavenging animals. At De La Salle, bones and personal effects near the chapel's altar where refugees had died praying. In Fort Santiago, skulls and bones in flooded cells near the river, where water had preserved remains that fire would have consumed. Body counts were imprecise by necessity. Fire, blast, and structural collapse had obliterated many victims beyond any possibility of identification. Multiple families sometimes shared the same pile of bones. Yet as teams methodically tallied remains, cross-checked reports from survivors and witnesses, and compiled lists of missing persons from parish records and family inquiries, a grim consensus emerged. At least 100,000 civilians had died in Manila between early February and early March. Some estimates, particularly those from Filipino sources compiling parish and neighborhood records, ran considerably higher, approaching 250,000 casualties when including wounded and missing persons whose fates would never be conclusively determined. When historians set these numbers beside those from other infamous wartime events, the comparison was stark and deeply troubling. The civilian death toll in Manila exceeded that of either Hiroshima or Nagasaki individually, though not the combined total of both atomic bombings. The Philippine capital thus joined Warsaw, Stalingrad, Dresden, and a handful of other cities as sites of near-total wartime destruction where urban populations suffered casualties approaching or exceeding those of major military formations. Physical damage surveys conducted by military engineers described Intramuros as more than 90% destroyed. Only a handful of major structures, like San Agustin Church with its massive Baroque walls, remained standing in any recognizable form, their survival seeming almost miraculous amid the devastation. Ermita and Malate were, in large part, flattened or burned out. University libraries, church archives, and government records that had survived 3 years of occupation were now gone forever. Centuries of documents and works of art were lost in weeks of fighting, erasing portions of Philippine cultural heritage that could never be recovered or reconstructed. Newsreel footage showed General Douglas MacArthur walking through the wreckage of the Manila Hotel, once his home, where he had lived with his family in spacious apartments overlooking the bay. The camera captured him moving carefully through debris-strewn rooms, past shattered furniture and fire-blackened walls, his expression notably restrained for a man usually conscious of image. No triumphant gestures accompanied this tour, only careful steps through rubble that had once been polished marble floors and elegant tile work. In military terms, the narrator explained, Manila was unquestionably a victory, a capital retaken, a major port restored to Allied use, an enemy garrison destroyed. American forces had broken Japanese resistance through superior firepower and determination. The harbor would soon be handling supply ships for operations against Japan itself. But for the people who lived here, for the families who had called these streets home, it was something else entirely. The central dilemma was now explicit and inescapable, a question that would be debated in war crimes trials and history books for generations. Who, in the end, destroyed Manila? The Japanese defenders who had turned it into a network of killing grounds and massacre sites, or the American liberators whose artillery and firepower had reduced entire districts to ash and rubble? The final act would examine how the world tried, and often failed, to answer that question, and how the people of Manila themselves chose to remember what had been done to their city. In October 1945, in a courtroom in Manila that had been hastily reconsecrated for legal proceedings, General Tomoyuki Yamashita stood before an American military commission. He had surrendered in northern Luzon after the emperor's announcement of Japan's capitulation, and was brought to the capital to face charges for atrocities committed by Japanese forces under his overall command, including the massacres in Manila that had claimed over 100,000 lives. The prosecution's theory rested on a doctrine of command responsibility that would become known as the Yamashita Standard in subsequent war crimes jurisprudence. Even if Yamashita had not personally ordered specific massacres, and evidence suggested he had actually opposed defending Manila, the prosecutors argued that he either knew or should have known what was being done by troops under his command and had failed to prevent or punish those crimes. As the commanding general, responsibility flowed upward to him regardless of his personal involvement or intent. Witness after witness described killings at Daipac, De La Salle, Fort Santiago, the Bayview Hotel, and countless other sites across the city. Documents and testimony linked many of these atrocities to units under the operational control of the 14th Area Army or to naval forces that fell under the broader Japanese command structure in the Philippines, even if they operated with substantial autonomy. Yamashita's defense centered on communications breakdown and the fragmented nature of Japanese command during the final months of the war. His attorneys argued that he had attempted to withdraw regular army units from Manila as part of his strategic plan to defend Luzon from mountain positions, that naval forces like those under Rear Admiral Iwabuchi had acted autonomously under their own chain of command, and that chaotic conditions and Allied attacks had shattered his ability to control or even communicate with all subordinate formations across the vast Philippine archipelago. The military commission was not persuaded by these arguments. On December 7, 1945, Yamashita was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. Despite appeals that went as far as the United States Supreme Court, where justices debated questions of military jurisdiction and due process in sharply divided opinions, the verdict stood. On February 23, 1946, exactly 1 year after Iwabuchi's presumed death in Manila, Yamashita was hanged at Los Baños, south of the capital. The Yamashita Standard would become a precedent cited in subsequent war crimes cases, establishing that commanders could be held criminally responsible for crimes committed by subordinates if they failed to prevent or punish such actions, even without direct orders or knowledge. The doctrine would be invoked in cases involving military leaders from multiple nations in conflicts from Vietnam to the Balkans. Iwabuchi, who had chosen ritual suicide in the ruins of Manila rather than face capture, could not be tried for his role in the city's destruction. In the Philippines, his name became synonymous with the city's devastation, the Butcher of Manila, in popular memory and historical accounts. In Japan, for decades after the war, his actions received comparatively little attention in mainstream public memory, part of a larger pattern of selective remembrance regarding wartime atrocities in the Philippines that differed markedly from the attention paid to atomic bombings and other events where Japanese were victims rather than perpetrators. No American commander faced formal charges or courts-martial for civilian casualties caused by United States artillery and air power in Manila. Contemporary American military accounts emphasize Japanese responsibility for using civilians as shields, for refusing to declare Manila an open city, and for continuing resistance despite being surrounded and cut off. Critics in later decades would argue that the extent of bombardment in densely populated areas raised its own moral questions about proportionality and discrimination between military and civilian targets, but these arguments remained largely academic rather than legal. In courtrooms and law journals, the narrator observed, Manila became a test case for how far responsibility should reach up chains of command. Legal scholars would debate the precedent for decades. In the streets of the city itself, survivors were wrestling with simpler and more immediate questions. How to live among the ruins, how to rebuild lives and communities, how to bury the dead when so many bodies were never recovered. While Yamashita's name entered international legal history as a precedent in command responsibility doctrine, most of Manila's 100,000 civilian dead remain nameless in official records. Another asymmetry in how justice and memory functioned after the war, where law and history recorded generals' names but not those of the families crushed beneath falling buildings or murdered in their homes. In 1946, a photographer whose name is now lost captured a street scene in Ermita that would become emblematic of post-war Manila. Children playing among chunks of concrete and twisted rebar, their makeshift shacks leaning against fragments of once grand houses, laundry hanging from improvised lines strung between ruins. It was an image of resilience and desperation repeated across central Manila, where life resumed amid devastation that would take generations to fully repair. Reconstruction began almost immediately, driven by necessity rather than comprehensive planning. But resources were desperately limited in a nation emerging from occupation and war. Political priorities lay elsewhere as new governments formed and reformed, and pre-war urban patterns were about to change in ways that would have profound implications for Manila's historic core. As the post-war decades passed, government and business investment shifted increasingly toward new districts, particularly Makati, which grew rapidly into the country's primary financial center with modern high-rises and American-style commercial development. Large stretches of Intramuros remained ruins well into the 1950s and even 60s, their reconstruction proceeding in fits and starts as funding and political will permitted. Later restoration efforts often recreated facades and exterior walls without fully restoring lost interiors or irreplaceable archives. Churches were rebuilt, sometimes in simplified form that captured external appearances while losing interior details and artworks destroyed in the battle. Many families who had lost entire kin networks in February 1945 never recovered remains to bury or identify. Mass graves and scattered bones made individual identification impossible for thousands of victims. The very scale of death overwhelmed traditional mourning practices and memorial customs, leaving psychological wounds that would be passed down through generations. Internationally, the Battle of Manila received far less attention than other climactic events of the war's final year. News coverage and popular memory focused instead on Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the firebombing of Tokyo, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the Nuremberg trials in Europe. In Japan and the United States, Manila tended to appear as a footnote in broader narratives about the Pacific War's conclusion, a relatively brief mention in histories focused on other battles considered more decisive or dramatic. Within the Philippines, however, survivors and their descendants worked persistently to preserve memory despite official neglect and international indifference. Memorial masses, small plaques on rebuilt structures, and published recollections kept individual stories alive even when government and media attention focused elsewhere. Over time, these grassroots efforts coalesced into organizations like Memorare Manila, 1945, dedicated to honoring civilian victims of the battle and ensuring their suffering would not be forgotten. All of this led, half a century after the battle, to the moment with which the film began, February 18th, 1995, in Plazuela de Santa Isabel within rebuilt Intramuros. The camera returned to that dedication ceremony. Elderly survivors and families of the dead gathered around the unveiled Memorare Manila 1945 monument, designed by sculptor Peter de Guzman with powerful imagery that captured both suffering and remembrance. At its base was an inscription written by Nick Joaquin, National Artist for Literature, dedicating the memorial to all those innocent victims of war, many of whom went nameless and unknown to a common grave, or never even knew a grave at all, their bodies having been consumed by fire or crushed to dust beneath the rubble of ruins. The text acknowledged two intertwined truths that had taken 50 years to articulate publicly: that most civilians were victims of heinous acts perpetrated by the Japanese imperial forces, who had turned neighborhoods into massacre sites, and that many also died as casualties of the heavy artillery barrage by American forces, who had bombarded the city to destroy Japanese resistance. In a single carefully crafted paragraph, the inscription rejected any simple assignment of blame to one side alone and instead insisted on remembering all who had been caught between opposing armies. In one shot, the camera focused again on Miguel Pérez-Rubio, now fully contextualized for viewers. The almost incidental figure from the opening scene was revealed as a man who had lost his entire immediate family in a single night of Japanese massacres, survived torture and imprisonment, and spent 5 decades advocating that Manila's civilian dead not be forgotten or reduced to statistics in military histories. The film then cut to present-day scenes. School groups walking past the monument on field trips, tour guides explaining the inscription to visitors, commuters crossing plazas built on former killing grounds without knowing what lay beneath the pavement, and tourists taking photographs of Intramuros's reconstructed walls without necessarily understanding how recently those stones had been relaid or what had necessitated their reconstruction. Manila, 1945, the narrator concluded, offers a warning about what happens when a modern army, determined to destroy a stubborn garrison, fights in a city whose defenders have chosen to wage war from basements, churchyards, and living rooms filled with civilians. In such places, liberation can become nearly indistinguishable from annihilation. Victory can look remarkably like mutual destruction. The line between liberator and destroyer blurs beyond recognition. Images of other shattered cities appeared briefly on screen: Grozny after Russian bombardment, Aleppo after years of Syrian civil war, Mosul after the battle against the Islamic State, suggesting without heavy-handed commentary that the dilemmas faced in Manila had returned in different uniforms and languages, that the questions raised in 1945 remained unresolved in the 21st century. The final shot returned one last time to the Memorare monument in golden afternoon light. The grieving mother and child, the figures clustered around her representing suffering and loss, the whole composition representing the over 100,000 men, women, and children killed in a single month in 1945. The narrator's last words echoed the intent carved in bronze and stone at the monument's base. Let this monument be, as its inscription says, a gravestone for each and every one of them. We have not forgotten them, nor should we ever forget. What is your perspective on this part of history? Share your thoughts in the comments, because every memory and reflection helps keep the past alive.